Hello, good evening. Welcome to anyone who's already here. Do feel free to say hi in the chat box. We're just before 7 and we'll give quite a few people a chance to arrive. So I can see we've got a couple of people just joining now. Good evening. Do feel free to say hello in the chat box there. Great to see people arriving. Hello, hello. Good to have you with us. Hi, Laura. Thanks for saying hi in the chat box there. Hope everyone's had a great day today. It's been absolutely beautiful. So just for those who are watching back on the video, my name's Debs. This evening I'm going to be talking about stand-up paddleboard touring in particular. So lots of people enjoy stand-up paddleboarding. It's very popular. See lots of people out and about on the rivers, and perhaps you thought about going on a longer journey, an overnight trip. That's what we're going to be talking about today. So when a few more people join and we start to get the Q&A going a little bit more, hopefully we'll have lots of different questions about that. You're watching this live on the Adventure Queens YouTube channel, and you can subscribe to the channel by clicking the red button somewhere on your screen, so you can do that. Hello to Nadia, who's just joined us. Thanks for saying hello in the chat box, Nadia. That's great. So the chat box is there on the right-hand side of your screen. You can use that to ask any questions. We have a few questions that have already been sent in, so we'll get going with those in just a moment. We'll just give a few more moments for people to join us. If you haven't yet seen the earlier video that tells you, give you a little bit of an intro to today's session, that's available on the YouTube channel as well. So you can just take a couple of moments to watch that. It is only 2 minutes long. So if you haven't seen that yet, you can go and check it out. If you haven't seen that, perhaps it's prompted some questions for you. Do feel free to pop those in the chat box. So we're chatting all things SUP touring. So we've got a few viewers ready, I think. So perhaps I'll start answering some of the questions from earlier. So I'll read those out so you know exactly what we're talking about. And thanks to everybody who sent these in. So the first question that came through today was how many hours day tour. So remember, I'm talking specifically about stand-up paddleboard touring, so going on a journey of a few days along a stretch of river. Well, the great thing is you're always paddling with the flow of the river if you make a good choice, so there can be a little bit of help from that. Generally, in terms of paddling hours, I'm not sure that I would be able to say exactly how many hours you're paddling for, but I suppose it's a bit like an all-day hike or an all-day bike. You kind of got a good 9 to 5 shift in there, but you've got a tea break and a lunch break and an afternoon tea, and if you like us, you'll eat cake all 3 of those. So it's a full day, but it's not going to be absolutely exhausting. It tends to be the case that when we're bivvying, and I'll come to that a bit more later, we do tend to make a bit of an earlier start, but then we probably have quite a long morning break or a long lunch break. So I'd say the total paddling hours isn't much more. So with that in mind, the mileage is quite variable because of the flow of a river or the not flow perhaps of a canal, and also things like the wind. So probably the most we've done in a day with luggage on the SUPs is about between 15 and 20 miles. That was on a river with really good flow and a tailwind. If it's flatter water, so not much flow and not much wind, then it tends to be a little bit harder going, and probably you're looking somewhere in the region then of 10 to 15 miles. Now, something else that makes a difference here is the river that you're on or canal that you're on, and the portaging of locks. So, or weirs if you were on not a river that's not a navigation. So that can take a really long time, and it's worth, particularly on when you're first starting talking about touring, to consider how many portages you would have to do. Just to give an example, the trip I talked about in the video was Leicester to Newark. On the first day through Leicester, so we started at Ayleston, southwest of Leicester, for anyone who's local, which I think is a journey of about 12 or 14 miles. I think there were 12 lock portages. So that was pretty tiring on the very first day of doing it, and getting used to that was pretty tricky. So Nadia, I'll come to your question now and come back, that's in the chat box, and come back to some of the earlier ones in a moment, because you've just asked, where does the luggage go on a SUP? Which is a great question, and it goes on the front of the SUP. So there's often some luggage straps there, some kind of bungee cords, and that's where it goes in. So the only difference with the luggage and no luggage when you're actually paddling is that you stand a little bit further back on the board to balance it. So where you stand when there's just you compared to where you stand when there's luggage, it is just slightly different to keep the board in a good balance there. And the luggage all being on the front of the board is not a problem at all in terms of any kind of other. It doesn't really affect any kind of paddling or steering, but it does affect how easy it is to get the board out of the water, because even if your luggage is not that heavy, it's very, very unwieldy to have such a long board with luggage just at one end of it. So although you might think, well, I know how much this weighs and I know I could lift it, in actual fact, when you're lifting the board out of the water, you're really unlikely to be able to do that with the luggage on, which makes lock portaging sometimes a little bit tricky. And I can share a story around this, because whenever we had on this first 4-day SUP trip, anything, or 5 days, I think it perhaps was, anything that was a little bit close in terms of maybe a possible unplanned swim, it did tend to happen at a lock, because what needs to happen is you need to get yourself and your luggage off the board and then the board out of the water and carry it round. So really helpfully, our paddle boards came with rucksack style dry bags. So we use those for all of our stuff, like all of our camping kit and everything like that. And they were then on the front of the board. Helpfully then we could wear that, carry the board, carry the paddle, and go around the locks. But it's some locks very straightforward, and sometimes there's even canoe, kayak portage points that are nice and low to the water. But at some, the freeboard, the gap between the water and the bank, it was very high, particularly through Leicester city centre. So often with an audience as well, we would have to kind of get in tight to the side, and then unhook the bag from the front of the SUP and lift it up onto the bank whilst you're not attached or anything to the side, and then climb out yourself and get the board out, or climb out yourself, lay on your tummy, reach down and unhook the bag and pull it up that way. So depending on the height or what the layout was, would depend on which of those options we chose, and it was sometimes quite awkward. And we did have an unplanned swim on day 3, I think, of that trip, where just at one point Joe was turning around to put the bag up on the bank, and the gap between the bank and the board became large enough for a person to take a little swim. But we do wear buoyancy aids, so it was only a little swim, and everything was very quickly remedied. So just for people who are joining us, I can see a few more people have joined us. This is a chat about SUP touring. That's what we're talking about, stand-up paddleboard touring. So do feel free to put any questions in the chat box. Covering a few questions from earlier. So far, we've just talked about mileage. Yeah, it was pretty funny, Laura, to be honest. We talked about mileage. We talked about the fact that portaging locks can be slow and can also be a little bit tricky. Usually the trickiest locks are the ones with the biggest audiences as well. So that is something to bear in mind. But I will say we have only had that one unplanned swim. And after the first tour, we did have a small refinement, because something that we carry anyway for a lot of trips, particularly bike trips, are bungees with carabiners at the end. So they have the clicky carabiners rather than an open hook. And we did use these to strap sort of as an additional strap to keep the luggage on the stand-up paddle boards. And we also have then subsequently used those if there's a ladder or something like that. If you've got some D-rings on your board, you can kind of loop around from a D-ring to, say, the ladder, and then that just stops that gap between board and bank ever forming while you're lifting your bag up. So yes, finding a good system that works for you on different height banks, and when there's two people, just one of us would climb off, and the other person can then unhook the luggage, and the person can do the elegant lay on the tummy and lift it off the boards and stuff like that. So it's there's a way around all of these things, and I imagine there are people who are far better paddle boarders who do it with a huge degree of grace as compared to ours. What is funny though is how quickly you get more confident with moving on and off the board. So it feels really awkward for the first few times, and then it gets much easier. And for high banks, you actually get quite used to kind of stepping straight down onto the board and starting from a standing position rather than going onto your knees first and then standing up. So you do get a lot better at those kind of things and get sort of a bit of a feel for it. So hopefully that answers a question on time as well, because I'm sure you can imagine that getting your board out, yourself out with the bag, walking around the lock, and sometimes it's a bit of a walk, does add quite a bit to your journey. So it's well worth just considering that if you're looking at mileage. Something that really helped us out when we first did a trip and then kind of gave us a bit of a ballpark to work from for all the subsequent ones was that because we stayed local, we actually camped in a friend's garden on the first night. We slept out in a friend's garden. So we kind of knew where we were going. And if we arrived late, it didn't matter because we didn't need to look for anywhere to sleep. And we also knew she'd have dinner ready for us. So that did make life a little bit easier. Also on that first trip, it was the River Soar up till Trent Junction, which is just between Loughborough and Nottingham, and then right onto the Trent. And actually, there were a number of points along that trip where if things had been going really, really badly, and we'd really not been enjoying ourselves, or the weather had turned even worse, it wasn't great the first couple of days. There were actually a couple of easy get out in terms of trains back to where we were living at the time. So we had probably 3 options of early get outs for the trip. And if you're planning a first trip and you're not sure how it's going to go, I mean, you're probably not going to take them because you want to do the trip you planned, but just in case things aren't going quite as you wanted to, having some of those early get outs can be really, really helpful. So let's just go back to some of the other questions because I'm keen not to miss anything out. So the first question, as we said, was about mileage. We said kind of 15 to 20 if you're going really on a fast flowing river and there's not much portaging. So on the Trent, it was flowing pretty quickly, and we had a good tailwind, so we were comfortably doing that kind of speed. Meant there was more time for cake stops. It was great. But on the River Soar, particularly through Loughborough, that is a canal really, and it's really flat water, and we had quite a headwind. It was more like 10 to 12 miles a day. So people asked then about the types of boards for touring. And I did a little bit of reading around this, but there really, as I said, there isn't a great deal you can find out about SUP touring, or certainly there wasn't a few years ago when I started looking. There's a couple of online blogs, and that was about it. So I did read that longer boards are slightly better for touring because they stay in line a little bit better. So when you're paddling, they're more likely to stay gliding straight, less twitchy from side to side. And that's true for other boats as well, I think. If you think about kind of touring sea kayaks, they tend to be quite a lot longer. So I got ones that weren't really short. I also, particularly having seen a couple of SUPs being used, I went for ones that were 6 inches deep, not 4 inches deep, because I was conscious, I think, of the weight of the luggage on the front and then the weight of the person. And if we really needed to, we could put 2 people on one SUP, I suppose. I don't know why we would do that. But so I picked ones that were 6 inches deep, so it does take a bit longer to put them up. They're about 34 inches wide, so that's pretty wide still, pretty stable. And ours are 10'8" long, but you can get ones that are specific touring boards that are 12'6", I think. The main thing I would think about a longer board would be that it would take even longer to pump up. And most of the time when you're touring, you're arriving at the river ready to go, you are going to be using your hand pump, not an electric pump. So yeah, that's something to bear in mind. And we found these fine for touring inland waterways in England. So I would say, probably most things that you can buy would do the job fine. My caution would perhaps be around the thinner ones, especially if you're a heavier person yourself, because I don't know if you've seen people supping them, and sometimes there's a bit of a bow in the middle. So then if you had the luggage on as well, you might find your feet were a little bit wet sometimes, I think. I don't think you'd be sinking, but you might have slightly damp feet. So that would be my recommendations on choosing a SUP. And as I said in the earlier video, we hadn't supped loads before. A couple of goes from people we'd met at the side of a lake and a hen weekend. It wasn't an extensive supping experience. So we didn't spend all of the money on the boards in case it didn't go well. But we kind of went sort of mid range, and they seem to have been reliable so far. So that's been great. So just looking at some of these other questions now. Lots of options. Okay, so Laura's just said she's seen people with boards that are really low in the middle. Yes, I can only assume that it's because they're thinner anyway, and perhaps the person hasn't pumped them up to the required pressure. So we do carry the pump with us on tour, because if there was a problem, it's pretty much the only way to solve it. But like putting air back in a bike tire. So we do carry the pump with us, and we do tend to check the pressures in the morning, and they stay pretty consistent. So that's quite good. The current seems to be a question, and I have kind of answered this by saying that some of the flatter water sections, like the more canal sections we've been on of a couple of different rivers, the navigable sections between the locks can be quite flat, and you don't get much help from the current. And then there's some where you do get more help from the current. And there was another question about what makes a river good for SUP touring. Well, I'm not really a water sports expert here. I will kind of say that I've done some paddle sports instructing through a school job a couple of years back, and we've done some overnight canoe trips and stuff, as well as the overnight SUP trips. But really, that they've all been kind of learn on the journey kind of things. But I would suggest that one thing to be considerate of when you're thinking about SUP touring is you have fins on the bottom of your SUP. So the kind of water that you would go over in a canoe or a kayak, being quite shallow and little bit exciting, just some maybe small white water, you would find a bit harder with your big SUP fin. Like the fins on our SUPs are about yay deep, so that's a consideration. The other consideration might be if you were going to pick a stretch with a lot of locks, you might find that you spend a lot of time portaging and not very much time paddling. So the BCU does recommend that you don't take your SUPs through locks. I'm not going to say here whether we've taken them through or not, but a lot of time portaging isn't as much fun as a lot of time paddling, so that would be worthwhile. But I will kind of reiterate here a point that I said in the video. I think it's really crazy to do a low carbon trip like a hike or a bike or a water trip, and have a really high carbon way of getting there. So to drive to one end and then have some kind of strange public transport or bus or taxi or whatever back to where you've left your car, or vice versa. And to me, that seems like a lot of faff for the length of an adventure that these often are. If I've got to spend a whole day traveling at each end for a 3-day trip, that's not a great ratio for me. So I would say the best river is the one you can get to and from easily, that you can find out some information about in advance. Like, can you find out that you have the right to be on the river? So are you a BCU member, and is this part of the navigable waterways? Have people supped or canoe or kayak toured this before? Were there any local things that you need to find out about? Song of the Paddle is a good forum there. You can ask for advice on there. Are there places you can get food and fuel along the route? I'm not really a fan of dehydrated food. I like the real stuff. So we maybe have one emergency food with us, but I'd much rather cook something proper or go out to eat on a short trip like this. So is there going to be somewhere I can pick up some food along the way, or am I packing for 4 whole days of food and packing a water filter because there might not be water? It depends on the kind of, I suppose, the ruggedness of the trip you like. And with that in mind, I would say you don't have to go to a remote area of the UK to feel like you're a long way away on a river trip. That's the beauty of it. I think it's the most famous 5 adventuring I've ever done, to turn up somewhere on a train and walk to the river, put the paddleboard in the river, and just go with it for the next few days. And you stop at the food where there is food, and you fill up your water where you can, and all that kind of thing, and it feels really great. So I'm just going to deal with the question that's coming in on the chat now, and then I'll go back to some of the ones from earlier. So thank you to Berenice. Did you use a PFD? So Berenice is talking about a personal flotation device or buoyancy aid. Yes, we did. There's some discussion about this with suppers, because some people do, some people don't. A lot of people on rivers and lakes do. I mean, you are attached by your foot most of the time to something that's really big and floaty. But yes, because it's the unknown fall, the unplanned fall, that's the one, isn't it? So although you think, well, And most of the time I'm okay on my SUP, I'm not wobbly or that kind of thing. It's exactly the same for me on a bicycle. I don't fall off my bicycle routinely, but the fall I don't plan for is the one I need my helmet for. So absolutely Berenice, yes, we did use buoyancy aids. It's just good sense. And we also carried a knife in case anything got stuck anywhere. And on occasional fast bits of river, we did not use our leashes, as per some of the recommendations. We also carried a throw line, a throw rope, in case of need, in case we needed to tow the other person or the other person's SUP or anything like that. And it was also quite useful for tying SUPs up. In terms of other safety stuff, I said we're not necessarily water sports experts. We've done a lot of long journeying by bike and long distance hiking and stuff like that, but we weren't necessarily water sports people. So a couple of things we did run through. As I said, I'd done a paddle sports instructor course a few years ago and done some leading of paddle sports and had run a water-based Duke of Edinburgh expedition, but my partner hadn't really. So we do have regular quizzes on what's different about first aid in the water, just while we're paddling along on day one, what would you do differently because we're on the water. So I think the main thing with keeping yourself and other people safe is to talk about the things that could happen, not in an, oh, we're really scared about this kind of way, but what would you do if kind of thing, can be really helpful. So that's not to put anybody off, that's just it is much easier to deal with something if you thought about it in advance. And we do carry a small first aid kit as well. Nadia said in the chat box there, I think your point about starting near you is more relevant now in COVID-19 times with decreased use of public transport and people not having cars. Walking to the start would be ideal. Absolutely. And not everybody's going to be in that position, but if you can be in that position, it's just brilliant. And actually, we've done 3 river trips now that have been very close to home or a short public transport right away. So Leicester to Newark when we were living in Leicester, and we now live in Stamford. So we've done Bedford to Ely, and a short weekend trip of Cambridge to Ely, and they were just both short train journeys. So that was really great to see beautiful stuff really, really near where you live. So I would thoroughly recommend having a little look and seeing what's around you. We've got quite the canal and river network in the UK. So I imagine there'd be something paddleable pretty near you. So just going back to some of the earlier questions now, if you have questions now while we're talking live, do feel free to put them in the chat box and I'll read those out and do my very best to answer them. So just picking up on some of the points from earlier, on an overnight trip, did we stay out overnight and did we plan that in advance? So I said that the very first night of the first tour was in a friend's garden, so that was really, really handy. But after that, no, there were no plans. And I get that for some people that's more hard to deal with than others. I presented at the Cycle Touring Festival earlier during lockdown, I suppose, earlier this year, and we had a conversation about whether you were a winger or a planner. Some people tend to fall into one of those camps. We did kind of have some loose things planned. So we knew where there was food and toilets and water bottle filling and stuff like that. So we knew that there was food at Redhill Marina and at Beeston Marina and Gunthorpe Marina, actually. And we knew where there were a couple of pubs and things like that. So that's always really helpful to know in advance. But we didn't plan out exactly where we're sleeping, quite simply because on that first SUP trip, we had no idea whether we had planned the right length of trip or not. We just kind of looked at a map and thought, yeah, it seems about right. It was about 70 miles over 5 days. So it really was kind of a bit of a test. And it turned out to be about right. In fact, we were a little bit faster because the Trent was fast, as I described earlier. So we didn't plan out where we were going to sleep, but we did find it quite easy to find places to sleep. And we took bivvies. And I suppose if you're kind of somebody who thinks about the whys and wherefores and legalities of wild camping, if you're in a bivvy, you're not in a tent, and in a bivvy you can rest on a footpath, and a lot of towpath is footpath. So if you were feeling uncomfortable or less comfortable about the legality of it, then maybe that would help. The great thing about finding somewhere to sleep near a river is that most of the time when you come off the river, nobody can get to where you are. So if you're somebody, again, who is concerned about the safety perhaps of wild camping, most of the time, unless you pick somewhere that's right by a road access, you are choosing somewhere on a riverbank that somebody can only get to really from the riverbank, or probably the farmer could get there. The downside of this is that on quite a lot of riverbanks, cows live, and I would never worry about anything when choosing to sleep. But trampled by cows is not high on my list while I'm tucked up in my bivvy. So very often we avoid places where it looks like, well, sometimes you can see the cows, but anywhere where there's been trampled bits and it looks like there has been cows. So, the edge bits of field have been no problem at all. Obviously, you're not ever sleeping in crop, you're not ever damaging something, you're outside of houses. We were once found by the farmer the next morning. His guy had come down to start doing something with the tractor, and we were just on the scrubby bit at the edge of the field. And the farmer and his mate walked over and said, "Oh, what you doing? Are you hiking or whatever?" And we said, "Oh no, we're on the paddle boards." I don't think they'd ever seen paddle boards before, and they said, "Oh yeah, have a good day," all that kind of thing. So most people, if you're respectful and we weren't leaving any rubbish, and you couldn't really even see that we'd been there, it was really kind of leave no trace. Most people are pretty tolerant, I think, if you're respectful. So it's not really ever been a problem to find somewhere to sleep. And I would say pretty much of the most of the time we have been able to pretty much accurately predict roughly what stretch of river we think we will get to. So that's been okay. If you were somebody who wanted to not wild camp, and perhaps you were happier to have things planned out, know where you're going to sleep, know there's definitely going to be drinking water, you can then leave all your belongings and walk to a pub. We can't usually do that. We would usually eat in a pub first and then go and find somewhere to sleep, which might not be everyone's idea of a relaxing evening. Then you could just look ahead and see where the campsites are along the river. And remembering that if you've got one of those big dry bag rucksacks to put your SUP in, you could even hike away from the river just a little bit. I mean, you wouldn't want to carry all your stuff on your SUP too far, but you could carry it a little bit away from the river if that was what you felt more comfortable doing. Also, I think it would be fun at some point to do the luxury SUP tour and stay overnight in pubs with B&Bs by the river. I think that would be dreamy. That you ask them in advance if you can leave the SUP pumped up outside. You haven't even got to pump it up again, and sleep in a bed, eat a nice pub dinner, and eat a nice pub breakfast in the morning, and then off you go. You probably won't need to eat again until the next pub. So I think there's a few different ways you could do that, depending on the level of comfort that you would like, and what you enjoy. It's supposed to be a holiday, so it should be fun. So just coming back to the distance thing there, Laura's saying she thinks 70 miles over 5 days is a decent amount. How many hours per day did you paddle? I think it was kind of a roughly about a 9 to 5 shift, Laura, and everyone. So a bit like when you go out for a full day, if you're going out for a multi-day hike or a multi-day bike, you're probably kind of actively working for about 6 hours, for like 5 or 6 hours paddling, I would suggest. So you do 9 to 5, but with a good long morning break, a decent lunch break, and an afternoon tea. Sometimes our hours are a bit funny. If we've bivvied, you tend to wake up with the sun. So then perhaps we get in a couple of hours before any boats are up on the river, but then have a good long stop somewhere for a quick breakfast or something like that. So it might be slightly kind of change. And certainly there's been times where we've kind of supped into the sunset, and that's really, really beautiful too. And then you can just find yourself somewhere to sleep. So Nadia says that supping for an hour she found quite uncomfortable. And it's really good that you've brought that up, Nadia, because at the end of that first day, we certainly had some kind of aches and stuff from doing as much supping as we had done on one day. And I think what happens is you kind of refine your technique, and probably having done a little bit of open canoe instructing helped a little bit there for refining a paddle stroke so it's nice and efficient. The other thing to do is to not try to kind of over pull on the paddle. I think Jo had a real problem where she was trying to really muscle it with her forearm and had really, really tired forearms. The other thing we found, and again, I don't know how true to real life actual supping this is that the longer we've been doing it, the more able we are to paddle on one side, just nice and steady, and not have the board twitch from side to side. So a lot of suppers you see, a few strokes this side, then a few strokes this side to keep the sup going straight. And particularly kind of on my favourite side now, I can go a long way in a straight line, which not only reduces the distance that you're covering, but also means you've got a nice efficient stroke. So I think some of that's just practice, and you are much less tense standing the longer you did it. So on the first day, we had really, really tired quads and core, because obviously you're really tense. You think you need to be really tense to balance the board or whatever, and you don't, and that soon comes with a bit more practice and a bit more just time on the board. And towards the end of the trips, we'll kind of step from board to bang. And on day one of the trip, if I did that, I would go swimming. But you kind of relax a little bit more and get to know how you can move around the board, and some of that tension then goes. And there's no actual reason to have tired quads on a SUP. So that's definitely just from being weirdly tense and getting used to it. It really, really did help that out. The other thing that can get a bit uncomfortable is if you're on your knees all the time. So the better you get standing up, the more comfy you are. It is also useful sometimes to paddle on your knees though, because if it's really, really windy, it does reduce the air resistance, and that really, really helps you. So Laura's just said about J-stroke. Yeah, so I would J-stroke in an open canoe. I don't really find it helps me on a SUP. So as I said, I'm not a SUP expert, but my open J-stroke, I don't really find that I can do that on a SUP. So maybe someone else can and can tell us all about it, and I'd love that. But actually, my SUP stroke that keeps me straight almost goes slightly. I'm almost slightly pushing the water under the board, I would say, rather than away. So maybe that's just a refinement I don't have yet. But certainly that's not the way I found to just keep it going straight. But I am happy to be corrected by an expert and go away and practice it and try again. So just picking up some of those questions from earlier, I'm really keen not to miss any of those, and also will be great to hear all your questions this evening. So if you have any, do put them in the SUP box. No question is too silly, and I have still got a couple of great things I'd like to share before our time is up. But I think we've covered kind of what makes a river better for touring, and mainly we said close to home and a water level you feel confident with. So you're not going to be going shooting any rapids anytime soon. Find something nice and flat that's navigable by boats is probably a good tip. There's a great canoe kayak map of the UK. You can buy it kind of on online bookshops and things, and it's slightly waterproof, and it tells you which routes are navigable and which routes are flat water. That's a really good product. I can't remember the brand, but that's a great investment if you're thinking about river trips. So a final kind of question from earlier was, would we say SUP touring needs specific gear or adapting other gear was adequate? So on that first trip, the only kind of water specific stuff we bought were the SUPs and the buoyancy aids. And yeah, I think that was it, the SUPs and the buoyancy aids. Everything else was amalgamated from other trips or other kind of discipline trips. So to keep valuables dry, we used the Sistema lunch boxes, the ones with the 4 clips that go around them. They seemed pretty waterproof. We thought that was a decent dry box rather than getting something with a screw top, and no water's got in so far, so seems to have done its job. And so into that, it's kind of a lunchbox size one, go phones and keys if we have them, and first aid stuff that needs to be kept dry, and like personal medication, whatever, that all goes into there. The dry bags that the SUPs came in are pretty good. I don't think they would survive a dunking. So if they actually went into the river, I don't think they would perform like an Ortley pannier and keep everything dry. But I do think if you got it out quickly, you'd just have things might be just a little bit damp. So we actually put all of our sleeping stuff in other dry bags, which were ones that we had that just go in panniers. Throw line is the other kind of specific piece of equipment that's water sport specific that you would need. Everything else was pretty fine. So we used kind of Keen sandals, the closed toed ones. I'm not sure I'd fancy doing all the portaging with open toed shoes. I think you'd have a few scraped toes at some points. So those Keen closed toed wet shoes, pretty good. And we actually often rock those out, styling them out with something like the sealskin socks if it's a drizzly day, because generally I'm not putting my feet in the water if I can help it. So I'll try and stay comfy if I can. Don't tend to wear swimwear because hopefully I'm not going for a swim. So I'd rather be comfortable in my normal undies. Just normal clothes, waterproofs. Normal, on a rainy day on the SUP, we'll just wear waterproof trousers, waterproof top, and the buoyancy aid, just like you would on a normal day, obviously with things underneath. But just normal clothes. I suppose more specialist kit. We have taken water filters on the longer trips, just in case you're ever away from clean drinking water. You could filter. We have a Sawyer filter. I've seen some good discussions online recently about different types of water filters. I think one of them was in the Adventure Queens Facebook group, so I'm sure you should go back and have a look through that. In terms of a stove, we tend to just take we've got the out kit version of the jet boil, so kind of more budget jet boil. So if we are preparing food, it's water and then couscous or or something like that, or a bit of porridge. We're not really doing any gourmet cooking. We're hoping to treat ourselves on the side at a marina or a pub or something like that most of the time. We always tend to take hot drinks flasks. We've got the Life Venture ones that fit in a bike bottle cage. Would fully recommend those. They keep stuff hot for ages, cold for ages, whatever. So you can always buy tea and take it somewhere later, or you can make your tea in the morning while you're bivvying, and then drink it a few hours down the river. Being able to make a hot drink if you were to fall in and the weather was to be a bit nasty is going to make you feel a lot better. It's going to give you a chance to calm back down. It's going to be a chance to get ready and reset. So I think a stove is really good if you're going to be camping out. If you're not going to be camping out, it's probably less of a big deal, because at the end of the day, you're going home and everything will be all right. You put the kettle on there, so less of a big deal. So I think to answer the question, repurposed kit from other sports has been fine for us so far. And I suppose I could probably, the easiest thing would be to put a full kit list onto the group if that was of interest to people. But really, I mean, we pack quite light, maybe dubiously hygienically at times, but you're talking one set of clothes you're wearing, a dry set in case you get wet, a few more clean socks and undies and that kind of thing, a base layer for if it's cold at night, and put a puffer jacket, down puffer jacket, and then a waterproof trousers, waterproof jacket, and a couple of buffs are really practical because they're good for warmth, good for keeping the wind out of your ears, and they're good for first thing in the morning when you're bivvying, so you can pull them down over your eyes and keep the sun out. So I'd say buffs are a really good multi-purpose accessory. Okay, so I'm just going to check back through these questions that I've got on my phone here, make sure that I haven't missed anything. And it'd be great to have any more questions that you've got into the chat box there. Okay, I think we've got pretty much all of those. There was a question about whether portage points might be different on different rivers. Yes, they are. I haven't worked out the pattern for this yet, but a lot of the ones on the Nene are really practical, nice low wooden platforms, clearly signed. Some of the ones on the Soar were not portage points, just where the boats would moor up to then use the lock. That can be a little bit trickier. So it's really just a bit for luck of the draw, seems to me, when you get there, what you find. And it's always good to have a little paddle. If you're not sure, have a little paddle, bit of a look around and that kind of thing. So a couple of questions in the chat box now. What time of year do we go? So the longer trips, so Leicester to Newark and Bedford to Ely. I think Bedford to Ely was about 60 miles, something like that. And both of those were long August bank holiday weekends, so with an extra day off, kind of either side. So they were both sort of 4 or 5 day trips. I think the first one was 5, second one was 4 days, and that was late August bank holiday. So 2018, awful weather for the first few days. Absolutely threw it down for particularly the day we went from the Soar to the Trent. Just hammered it down all day. I can't share screens on this, I don't think, but it was just grim on one of the days. And then last summer, that August bank holiday, maybe you remember, was the really, really hot days, particularly in the Midlands. It was super, super duper hot. So it was absolutely beautiful to just be out on the river every day. It felt really like a dream world adventure, that one, actually. Just didn't ever feel rushed because it was light so late, as and not cold into the evening. So there was no pressure to find anywhere to sleep or whatever. It was fine. So overnight sleeping was fine on both of those. We weren't cold at all. From the Cambridge to Ely trip, we slept between Cambridge and Ely on the way. There's very little nutrition on that trip, though. That's worth considering. There's one pub you can get food and one marina that'll sell you a pop and an ice cream, and that is it. So that stretch of river did need a little bit more packing from us, and we were extremely hungry when we got to Ely on the Sunday afternoon. So Laura's asked, with overnight sleeping, where do we leave the SUPs? Just kind of next to us, on the bank. Just the main thing, the main thing would be that they're in the shade. It says on all the SUPs, in usually quite prominent, don't leave me in the sun when I'm inflated, because of then the air pressure rising and the chambers being damaged inside. So because in the morning you could be in full sun, not necessarily where you're expecting, we always took them out and put them in the shade. We didn't leave them in the water overnight, although that would be good temperature wise for them. They could easily have just got in someone else's way, and it's also a bit less obtrusive to take them out and put them at the side somewhere with us. So we just had them next to us. Again, I'll pop some photos on social media perhaps after this, and people can see some of those. There's also a little blog about the first trip, the Leicester to Newark trip, on the Ordnance Survey website. I think it's called Wonderful Waterways. So you can read up on that there. And there was a kind of slightly different story about that same journey in Intrepid magazine. Anyone who buys that magazine, but that was quite a long time ago now. You could maybe have a riffle back for your 3 back issues. So the SUPs just come out onto the bank with us when we're sleeping, know exactly where everything is, and feel nice and tucked up. And actually, the one of the nights between Bedford and Cambridge, and I think it was the night we were just outside St Neots, the sky was incredible because we weren't really near any towns. St Neots was still a good few hours paddle away, and the number we could see stars like you were in the middle of nowhere, and we're just in the Midlands, which people think is not a particularly exciting part of the UK. So that was fantastic. So something no one's asked about, but I'm going to tell you about anyway, is the wildlife, because I just think it's been incredible how much wildlife there is on, again, the waterways that you would think, well, you start a trip in Bedford, how exciting can it be? But as soon as you're anywhere a little bit quieter on the river, you can see so many dragonflies and damselflies and different water birds I don't know the names of, loads and loads of different stuff. And it never gets old seeing a swan take off and watching it kind of paddle its feet along the top of the water. It's just fantastic. And that means this now means I get to talk about the best wildlife moment I think I've ever had in the UK. So the day it was really miserable, and we're going between Red Hill, so just north of Loughborough and West Bridgford. So it's not the super glamorous bit of the trip, because you're going to go past a big power station at Ratcliffe on Soar, and go down through a bit of Nottingham past the football grounds, all that kind of thing. Well, just before you get to Beeston, there's a really exciting little island that's owned by the Scouts. So we got off on there and had a bit of a look. So there's no one there. But then a bit later on, you're going through something called the Attleborough Nature Reserve, and it was beautiful actually. There was lots of big high green banks. Some people walking on the top, but not many people because it was really miserable. And it was really nice. You could have been anywhere. You could have named, where do you think we are? It could be anywhere in the world. And just looking ahead on the river, in amongst all the falling raindrops, I could see some disturbance on the top of the water. It didn't really look like a bird that was ducking and diving. It didn't really look like a fish popping up from beneath, because it was bigger than that, but it wasn't really behaving like a bird. And I just thought, I've wanted to see otters for so long in my life. I really hope this is otters, but surely just a few miles out of a big city, this is not going to be otters. And we got closer and closer to these kind of disturbance in the water, and it was a family of 3 otters that kind of swam past us, and one had a good old look at us. And I've got a video, but it's too far on the GoPro, is too far away for you to really see it. And I just thought that was the best thing, and that kind of got me through that whole quite miserable day of rain. And it was really windy later on as well, and really hard work. The fact that we'd just seen these 3 otters just kind of playing around, and pops his head up, had a good look at us, carried on past, and that was one of my favourite wildlife experiences, I think. And it happened just a few miles from where I lived for a long time through university, to just a few miles from Loughborough, and on a bit of river that maybe you wouldn't think would be that exciting. So whatever you think, you think, oh, I don't fancy that bit of river, it doesn't seem that exciting. Well, maybe you'll see something amazing too. So I really enjoyed that. It's probably one of my favourite things that happened on the SUPs. So I'm really keen to hear any more questions in the chat box. Do go crazy with those. And just having a little bit of a check through here. So some other recommendations for SUP touring rivers that I've had recently: the Avon from Stratford upon Avon or Leamington Spa, sort of somewhere around there, down to through Tewkesbury and carrying on that way. I've had a recommendation of the Severn, which is navigable for quite a lot of its course, and also for the Thames. And I've found out recently, and I think the Thames might be my next subject for this reason, that the Environment Agency allows camping at some of the locks along the Thames if you're on foot or by a person-powered craft, so a canoe, kayak, SUP. So that would be really cool. I think that might be my next one, and I think you get quite a good push from the water on some days on the Thames as well. Just worth bearing in mind that past Teddington Lock it becomes tidal, so that would be the point to stop unless you were with somebody who understood the tides and when would be safe to board. And I would imagine you'd have to inform whoever's responsible for the river at that point. Nadia, some of the campsites are closed at the moment. Yes, they are still closed at the moment. I've got my fingers crossed that in a couple of weeks' time they won't be, because that's when our annual leave is. Yeah, so we'll see how that goes. I'm really hoping that changes soon. Some of them are on islands, I think, as well, so they're super exciting. Yeah, so the thing to bear in mind is that you've probably got up as far as Teddington Lock, and then after that, that's going to be your end point, or you perhaps need to be a little bit more mindful of skill level and water knowledge and all that kind of thing. So supping on a tidal river isn't something I can advise on today. So just seeing another question there from Laura. Laura said, what are the human powered journeys? Well, we've done a lot of cycling. So started off cycle touring with a 10-day trip to Normandy a number of years, about 10 years ago now, where mainly we didn't ride the bikes very much, and we ate a lot of cheese and drank some wine. It was a great trip. It's certainly inspirational stuff. But what that meant was that a few years later in New Zealand, we bought some secondhand bikes and rode around New Zealand, which if you can ride around New Zealand, you can ride anywhere, because it's really pointy. The drivers don't like it very much. The roads are really narrow, and you've not got much choice of routes, and stuff's a really long way apart. So sometimes it's a good old long day between shops or between campsites or whatever. So once we'd done that trip, we thought cycling was all right. So we'd done about 6 weeks, about 1,500 miles, something like that, around New Zealand. So in summer 2012, after working in Vancouver, we decided to start riding towards Toronto, where our flight home was from, and got as far as Winnipeg before we ran out of time. So that's a pretty big trip. Then you can see that one on a world map. So by this point, we'd ridden a really pointy country, New Zealand, and we'd ridden really far, because you could see it on a world map in Canada. So then it was kind of, well, at some point we'll leave work and ride from the front door and see how far we get. So in 2015, that's what we did, and in total rode about 20,000 miles in over 30 countries, and then came back and went back to normal, I suppose. Went back to a time where you don't wash up by licking things clean, I think is the main discernible difference there between life on tour and life at home. Greater level of hygiene and slightly less weird tan lines. So that was a really, really big trip. And I really like looking at maps and seeing, oh, you started here and you got here, and I did that myself. So and the same with walks. So actually, and I still think some of my favourite overnight journeys have been the UK. So since we got back, while you're away from the UK, you spend a lot of time thinking about all the things you'll do in the UK when you get back. So since we got back, we've walked from Salisbury to Tring. So that's mostly the Ridgeway and a few little other bits. That was about 8 days. And then last Easter from Settle to Carlisle, but not via the train route. So we walked through the Dales and the lakes, and then got the train back a different route. So that was a really brilliant trip. I would fully recommend that one, because it's not a national trail, but we found a book on eBay by a guy called Hugh, I think his name was, who'd walked it. And it was a great book, really handy. So used that as the kind of basis for the route, but we did amend some bits where, because they sort of B&B'd it, I think, and we were camping. So amended it a little bit and had a great adventure, and that was just beautiful. We were really lucky with the weather, and it was sensational. And we landed on the penultimate night, last night, just outside Carlisle, in the village of Heskett Newmarket, which has got a community-owned pub, and it was Easter Saturday night, and it was Egg Conkers night. So you just never know what things are going to throw up when you go out and find some new places. So yeah, so really enjoy those human powered trips. And it means you get to eat more cake, obviously, so you burn the calories. So that's a big advantage as well, is you don't have to worry about what you eat for a good length of time and all that sort of thing. So really enjoy those. So if anyone's got any more questions about supping, that'd be great, or any kind of overnight trips, I suppose. Now we're sort of onto those. And the next SUP trip, I think, for us will be on the Thames, or possibly, I think, maybe the Avon that I mentioned earlier. So how do I fit it in around my job? That's a great question. I'm a teacher, so I get 13 weeks holiday a year, which is absolutely fantastic, and is the main. Well, no, it's not the main. I love being a teacher, but it's a great benefit of being a teacher is that much holiday. My partner does not get that much holiday, so we're kind of bound by normal annual leave, like most people. So I suppose just maxing out where you can, things like if you've got a bank holiday, can you also have the Friday or the Tuesday and get in a good 4 or 5 day adventure there. Easter's a really good one to use because, again, you've got Good Friday, Easter Monday. So we tend to do hiking trips at Easter. You can get a decent hiking trip in without using much annual leave. For the longer trips we've done, they've all been kind of work quitters, which I appreciate is not an option available to everybody. But for one trip, I had a sabbatical of an academic year from school, but the longer trip was a quit the job and find one when you get back, and that's a bit like you have to decide if you're a winger or a planner. You have to decide the level of risk you're comfortable with in terms of can you leave work and get work when you come back and all that kind of thing, and can you frame your trip in such a way that it might seem valuable to an employer? Do things move on really fast in your industry? I think if I was to have 3 to 5 years out of teaching in a row rather than just 1 or 2, that might start to make it more tricky for me. So I think that's kind of all going to be down to personal circumstance, really. If you're lucky enough that you can take 3 or 4 weeks leave at one time in the summer, then there's lots of great trips you can do, which still don't involve flying. I'm really a lot, and Anna Hughes, you're going to be proud of me here. Flight Free 2020. We'll do pretty much anything not to fly and still have an adventure. So if you've got 3 or 4 weeks, you can have a great cycle trip on the continent, or you can ride up to Scotland and go around the Outer Hebrides. There's so much you can do in the UK or on the continent without flying. Obviously, at the moment, it's slightly different with the restrictions on travel and just keeping yourself and other people safe by not traveling around too much. Nadia, I agree. Cake is a core adventure component, absolutely a core adventure component. And Laura is pointing out that in the press recently, there's been quite a lot around the issue of wild camping, because we seem to have two groups of wild campers at the moment. The people who normally wild camp and do so respectfully and leave no trace, a bit like I talked about earlier. The farmer didn't mind that we were in the corner, the scrubby little corner of his field where no crops were ever planted, because there was, quite clearly going to be no trace when we left. But there's been quite a lot in the press recently, and there was an article in the Guardian yesterday, I think, about some quite irresponsible wild camping, almost kind of a la end of festival, where people just leave all their stuff. Now, I mean, this is just wrong to me on so many levels. Leaving stuff is really ridiculous, terrible. The littering side of it just doesn't fit for me at all. So wasteful for things that probably can't be recycled. And also just the idea that we would ruin our beautiful places by not tidying up properly after ourselves. So I was really disappointed to see those things, Laura, as I'm sure you were too. There's been quite a lot on social media about that too. So I really hope that people can choose to wild camp responsibly or choose not to wild camp. I think that's really the only thing, because it doesn't help any of us who can do so responsibly to have people not doing it right. Has anyone ever given us any trouble over it? No, but we are quite careful about where we choose to wild camp. We are really thoughtful about it. We wouldn't be anywhere obtrusive. On bike trips, for example, if the only option has been somewhere obtrusive, then we just tend to ask people in advance, and that's usually okay. And a good tactic for this is to engage in another conversation first, to give them a bit of time to check you out and you to check them out. And then if they're a bit crazy, you can just carry on. So maybe ask if there's somewhere you can fill your water bottle, something like that. That's quite a good gateway into then what you do and where you go in. And then you can sort of have a conversation about safe sleeping places and that kind of thing. But absolutely not, Laura. We've never had any problems with wild camping. Anybody said anything other than have a nice day or whatever. But we are rarely found, so maybe that's something to do with it. So just coming up to the end now. We're just kind of got a few minutes left, so of the hour. So it'd be great to have any more SUP related questions or touring related questions, planning related questions. No one's asked about maps yet, so I'll tell you that we use the OS app on a phone, and we do tend to try and take on the SUP trips, because we're probably going to have no electricity the whole time, a little rechargey pod thing. I can't remember what they're called, power pack kind of thing, and just don't use the phones very much, and then they tend to hold the battery all right. Especially mine, which is so ancient it can't run any apps anyway, so tends to keep its battery just fine. And then waterproof OS maps also are useful to take, because they do mark the locks, they also mark weirs. You can kind of pick out from the OS app where might be a good stretch for camping and where might be a bad stretch for camping, that kind of thing. So the mapping there can be really helpful. Also, it is quite time consuming because it doesn't click to follow, but we have kind of looked at mileages in advance by clicking routes along a route on a route planning app. So again, we've used OS apps, but you could use something else, I suppose, to look at how far it was between certain towns, say on the river. And sometimes narrowboat websites are quite useful for that. If you're on a navigable river, you can kind of predict where they are. So particularly if you're a planner, so that's a good thing to do. Some quick Google searches of where the cafes and the pubs are is always handy as well, and where the shops are. We've never really found a little co-op or anything within walking distance of the river, but one day there might be one for food. So we do always have a little look with what's coming up. And I would say it's destroyer tactics really in terms of food. So you know how sometimes you might see a pub and you think, well, I'm not really hungry right now, I could probably go another hour. On a river trip, I would say you don't think like that. You think there's a pub, let's eat now in case there's no pubs for the next day and a half. It's more that kind of thing. So I think it was a Dave Gorman book about driving across America where he described this as destroyer tactics. You fill up with fuel every time you see fuel, just in case you don't see any other fuel. So I would say same applies for river trips in the UK. Destroyer tactics. Fill it with fuel every time you see fuel, even if you think you didn't need the fuel. Laura's just asked what was the canoeing map I mentioned earlier. I think it's called a Waterways Map of Great Britain, and it's slightly kind of plasticky, waterproofy. I can do a little search right now, and I'll just check out and see if there's any other questions coming in or as well. So this map would be a kind of a map for overall trip planning, not for the day-by-day planning. This is just like a look at the map and think, oh yeah, I'd really like to do that one day. That's sort of what you're looking for with this one. It wouldn't help you with the nitty-gritty of map design. It's an unfoldable one, so not a foldable one, not a spiral bound book. So I'm struggling to identify it right now. Yeah. Okay, it's called the Canoe Kayak Map of Great Britain. There we go. So that is definitely worth a look. The Canoe Kayak Map of Great Britain, folded map. It's blue and red on the outside. So I would certainly recommend that as a kind of a good way to start thinking and dreaming, and stick it on your wall and think, oh yeah, one day I'll do a little bit of that. One really interesting thing I read about is there's a circuit you can do of England's waterways that takes in several rivers and canals. So you're going the upstream way of some of them. We've tended to do downstream trips because it's a little bit easier. But and I can't remember. And then it's named after a guy, and it's about a 600 or 800 mile circuit, and that would be a really great trip to do sometime, or to do in segments and do different sections of that. So a lot of the waterways perhaps join up a little bit more than you might think from the age of the canals, I suppose. All right, so I'm just keeping an eye on the chat box to see if we've got any other questions. If you have any questions that you haven't thought of today, you're very welcome to get in touch. So you can get in touch through the Adventure Queens Facebook group. You can also get in touch through other social media. So if you want to look at some pictures from SUP trips, you can go on to @breaks and cakes. That's breaks like bike breaks and cakes like cakes you eat. We've covered those a couple of times already today. And there's some SUP trip photos on there, and you're welcome to have a look at those and ask any questions. Laura said, what license do we have? Yes, like you, Laura, we have a BCU licenses. I know that you talked about this on the canoe Skillshare share a few weeks ago that I really enjoyed listening to. We have the British Canoe Union license, which is for waterways. Interesting that you say your local river says that doesn't apply. I would perhaps be tempted to look into that. That might be just one landowner who's been a bit less accessible than others. So I would have a little look at that one. I've never had my license checked, I would say that, but I do think it's really important. And if we want things like portage points for canoes, kayaks, and SUPs, then we kind of have to buy into the body that's going to set those up, or lobby for those to be set up. So I know that a lot of people think, oh well, I don't have a license, it won't ever be checked, that kind of thing. I think it's really, really important to kind of contribute to BCU, because they prepare kinds of canoe routes that you can download and do, and you could do those on a SUP as well, and look after some of the portage points and all that kind of thing. So do look into that. Yeah, so Laura got her BCU license. Yeah, I think it's a good thing to do. And if you were to look at, say, day licenses, they really don't represent good value for money. And I know that there are some places in the country where paddlers are regularly asked to show their licenses, like the Norfolk Broads. Nadia's asked about BCU licenses being per person or per vessel. Nadia, they are for you, the person. So if I lent my SUP to somebody else, they, in theory, would need their own license. I don't know what it would be like if I had an open canoe and then I took someone else in it. I don't know the answer to that, though, I'm afraid. I think most people with the dog on the SUPs probably don't need a license for the dog. Okay, so Berenice is putting there about Bristol Harbour. Yep, so that's slightly different because it's not an inland waterway. Yep. Yep, so an advantage of the BCU membership as well is that you do have liability insurance on rivers and canals. Great point, Berenice. Thank you for that. Yeah, I can't answer that, Nadia. Actually, I just hadn't really thought about it. Sorry about that. Perhaps one you can tweet them about or something like that. Might be worth doing. Yeah. You can get a household membership, which is slightly discounted as compared to individual people. So that might be worth looking into as well if that's relevant to your situation. And I think there's also a family membership for adults and children that may be of interest to people watching. Great. So we're kind of at our time limit, I think. Laura, you can tell me if I'm right or wrong on that one. So I think if we were to kind of sum up for some of the main questions that we have about river choices and equipment choices and all that kind of thing, I would say, before you embark on a tour, make sure you've done at least a couple of goes on a SUP and you can get it going in the right direction and feel confident standing up and moving around and getting the board in and out of the water, because certainly probably where you put in will be the easiest place that happens on the whole trip. Think carefully about the equipment you need, but don't necessarily rush out and buy loads of specialist stuff. Keeping things dry is really important, just like on any other expedition, whether you're on a bike or foot. You want to be able to get warm and dry and that kind of thing. And think carefully about the river you're choosing, not only in terms of your paddling ability, but also the proximity to you and the location, and are there some get out points if things are going badly. People said, oh, that's a good idea. That really made us feel confident about that first trip. We had no idea whether we could do it or not, but we knew we could turn back or get out and get on a train if there was a problem. And we also made sure that we talked through what some of the potential hazards would be, and talked about those as we were going along the river as well. You point out to the other person the things that are not going so well. I would recommend you don't go out paddling solo, and that's a BCU recommendation as well. So think about that. And also just consider about the type of water you're choosing. Is it water you feel confident in? Flat water would be a good place to start. A stretch of river where the portage points are quite easy, where you practice that might be a good place to start. And just making sure you do everything you can to keep yourself and whoever you're paddling with nice and safe, so you can enjoy all the wonderful things about a waterways trip: the peace, the quiet, the damselflies, beautiful scenery, big skies at night time, and all that kind of thing. So thanks very much to everyone. And I think if Laura and Nadia give me the okay, I'm going to press end stream, unless we have any last questions in the box. Thanks, Berenice. It's been great to have your questions. Really appreciated that. I'd be really interested to hear from you of any SUP routes you've got down the southwest there. So do feel free to pop those in the Facebook group or on the Instagram or Twitter. That'd be great. And don't forget, you can subscribe to the Adventure Queens YouTube channel, and on different Monday nights you can hear about all sorts of different adventures as well. So great stuff. Alrighty, so I'm going to end the stream now. Say goodbye to everybody. Wish you the very best of the rest of July and August. And I hope we get some summer sunshine in to make up perhaps for some things we're not going to be able to do, and find some ways to adventure safely, locally, close to home. Take care.